The geopolitical landscape in Europe has changed drastically in the wake of the war in Ukraine. Countries such as Sweden and Finland ended their neutrality, which had lasted for centuries in some cases, and voted to join NATO. Finland is now officially a member and Sweden is likely to join in the near future. As a result, the circle of neutral states in Europe is becoming ever thinner. But in the heart of Europe, almost completely surrounded by NATO countries, lies a country that has declared its official neutrality to this day. And this despite the fact that it is otherwise represented in almost all Western institutions and maintains close partnerships with Western countries. We are talking about Austria, which, along with Switzerland, appears as a blank spot on the alliance maps. But the new war in Europe could change a lot of things. Because in Austria, too, the voices in favor of joining NATO are getting louder and neutrality is also on shaky ground. Why has Austria always declared itself to be strictly neutral? How neutral was it really, and how likely is it to join NATO in the near future? We take a look at all these fascinating questions in today's video. To understand Austrian neutrality, we need to look back to the time of the First World War. Back then, Austria, or the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, as it was still called at the time, suffered a drastic defeat. The Austrian Empire, which had lasted for centuries, collapsed and broke up into numerous small individual states. Austria shrank to its present size and now found itself relatively defenseless in the middle of Europe, surrounded by expansionist superpowers such as Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union. And in anticipation of this new reality, the last prime minister of the Imperial Royal Monarchy formulated a plea for neutrality in the year 1918. He outlined how easily Austria could now be attacked from all sides and that a lasting peace could only be achieved through strict neutrality and a balance between the great powers. However, the plea met with very little approval at the time. The population did not want to accept this new reality and the shrinking international influence and wanted to be part of a major European power again. And so many Austrians longed to join Germany, which was also defeated in the war but soon caught up with the other powers. Accordingly, Hitler had an easy time of it when he invaded Austria in the year 1938 and announced the annexation. But as a result, Austria found itself in another world war and once again on the losing side. And so, like Germany, it was occupied by the four victorious powers of Russia, the USA, Great Britain, and France. And the post-war period was ultimately of fundamental importance for Austria. The country was searching for its national identity and for ways to end the occupation and regain its sovereignty. The victim thesis, i.e. the idea that Austria was the first victim of National Socialist Germany, became a central narrative in the early post-war period. This perspective helped to distance Austria from the sins of National Socialism and fueled hopes of an early end to the Allied occupation. And so negotiations about Austria's future began early on. However, although the negotiations seemed quite promising, the situation was exacerbated by the emerging East-West conflict. For Austria, it was clear that it wanted to be a clearly Western state. They wanted nothing to do with neutrality and non-alignment and wanted to be part of a powerful military bloc. The USA, Great Britain, and France supported this, but the Soviet Union naturally opposed it. Stalin did not want to give up the state with its central location in Europe just like that. And so the negotiations stalled for years and Austria seemed to be divided like Germany. It was not until Stalin's death that the negotiations gained new momentum. The new Soviet leadership was more moderate and agreed to a compromise proposal. In order to regain sovereignty and persuade the Allies to withdraw, Austria offered not to become part of the Western Bloc, but to act as a neutral buffer between the two blocs. This finally convinced both sides, and in the year 1955 the Moscow Memorandum was signed, whereby Austria once again retained its full sovereignty. 10 years after the end of the war, Austria was once again independent, in complete contrast to Germany, which was to remain divided until 1989. And the resolutions of the Moscow Memorandum were finally formulated a month later in a state treaty, which forms the legal basis of neutrality to this day. But what did it look like in detail? First of all, it committed Austria to perpetual neutrality along the lines of Switzerland. It then confirmed Austria's borders as they existed before the Anschluss to the German Reich in the year 1938. In response, however, it was explicitly mentioned that Austria undertook never again to enter into a political or economic union with Germany. Austria was also not allowed to allow any foreign military bases on its territory and was not allowed to possess any nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons. And as a further concession, it undertook to pay reparations, mainly in the form of goods deliveries. In contrast, however, the Allies agreed to leave the country immediately and return sovereignty to the Austrian government. And so perpetual neutrality became the central element of Austrian foreign and security policy. This neutrality was intended to protect Austria from future international conflicts and strengthen its position as an impartial actor on the world stage. Neutrality became particularly relevant in the context of the Cold War. While Europe was divided into two hostile blocs by the Iron Curtain, Austria was in a unique position as a neutral bridge between East and West. This position allowed Austria to maintain diplomatic relations with both sides of the Iron Curtain and serve as an important venue for international talks and negotiations. As a result, numerous summits were held in Austria, and Vienna became the headquarters of many international organizations. For example, the headquarters of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, is located in Vienna, as is OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, and the World Bank is also represented with several offices. However, neutrality also gave the Austrians a strong emotional and identity-forming component. After the traumatic experiences of the two world wars and the occupation, neutrality embodied a new beginning for many Austrians, a chance to distance themselves from the past and build a peaceful, independent future. However, neutrality always stood on shaky ground. When the Soviet Union crushed popular uprisings in Hungary and the Czech Republic, Austria clearly showed solidarity with the oppressed against the Soviet Union and subsequently took in numerous refugees. The Austrian soldiers also had an order to shoot if the Soviet soldiers crossed the border illegally, but fortunately this did not have to be carried out. Not only politically, but also economically, Austria distanced itself further and further from the Soviet Union and became part of the Western community of states. And so, in the year 1995, it finally became part of the European Union. The Soviet Union was now history, and a weak Russia emerged from it, which first had to find its place on the world stage again. And so Austria grew even closer to the West during this time. The country eventually joined the NATO Partnership for Peace and repeatedly took part in NATO missions, leading many to debate how neutral Austria still is today. What is certain is that Austria is represented in almost all Western institutions and is almost exclusively in line with NATO politically. Nevertheless, it makes no attempt to join the alliance. Austria's federal chancellor declared, "Austria was neutral, Austria is neutral, and Austria will remain neutral." And even though an open letter from 50 prominent Austrians to the federal president made headlines in the media last year, the opinion of the population is relatively clear. In recent surveys, 75% of respondents were in favor of retaining the status of neutrality. In reality, Austria has no real reason to join NATO. It is surrounded on all sides by NATO members and its close ally Switzerland. It therefore has no reason to fear invasion, in contrast to Finland, which recently joined NATO and has a border with Russia that is over 1,000 kilometers long. And as the whole of NATO would close its airspace in the event of war, Austria would also be protected. Austria also benefits from its neutrality status. It is highly valued internationally as a neutral mediator, and it is no coincidence that the offices of some of the most important institutions are located in Vienna. It is therefore very unlikely that Austria will join NATO in the near future. The country will continue to maintain close relations with NATO countries in order to benefit from its defense capability, but without being a direct member.